Feedbacking. I think we don't need to live stream it. I don't think very many people get on there. Oh, if you'd like to, I'm just gonna get situated. You can catch up. We won't get into the meat of it until, yeah. Okay, so we're gonna begin right now. Last time we met, we talked about Abraham and Sarai in Genesis. We were looking at narrative analogy. It's been a little bit of time, but we were looking at the chart where we were looking at Genesis 12, and we're looking at the structure of Genesis 12. And we were still studying the word tov, right? We're just tracking tov throughout the text. So do you remember in the Pharaoh story in Genesis 12 when Abraham gives his wife over to the Pharaoh, right? He gives his wife over to the Pharaoh, and then what does he say to her again? What does he say to Sarai just before the Pharaoh conversation?
That you'll be my cousin, right? So that
Please say that you are my sister, so that there will be tov for me on account of you, right? Please say that you are my sister, so that there will be tov for me. There will be tov for me on account of you. In other words, at your expense, so that I might live on account of you. And it came about when Abram came into Egypt, and the Egyptians saw that the woman was beautiful. Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And he did tov to Abram on account of her, and there was for him sheep and oxen and donkeys and male and female slaves and female donkeys and camels. And Yahweh plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues on account of Sarai, Abram's wife. Pharaoh called Abraham and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife, take her and go." And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and everything that belonged to him. Right? So immediately, what are some repetitions from your recollection that you saw? Saw?
good to me
Yeah.
on account of you,
Tov, see?
good to Abraham on account of her.
And then now then, here is your wife, take. Right? See and take. Right? So things have swapped around, remember? The woman saw that the fruit was good for food, and she took and ate. Right? And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and everything that belonged to him. See what? See her and take her. Right? And what does she look like? She's beautiful, beautiful of sight, right? So tov, of sight. And then here we are. A new word has been introduced. This word right here, yefat. The word yefat. In other words, at this point, it's been seeing tov things that are good to look at. Remember, this is exactly the vocabulary of the tree. To see, it was tov of sight. Now it is not just tov of sight, it's yefat of sight, or beautiful of sight. Now, who or what is it that's yefat of sight?
The Egyptians, so Sarah,
But what is the thing that's yefat of sight? It's not a tree this time, or the fruit. It's a woman. Now the woman is the forbidden item, right? Woman is the thing that is yefat of sight. Just like with the Nephilim, right? In the Nephilim story in Genesis 6, the women are beautiful, tov of sight, right? And so the beautiful woman has become the narrative analogy of the forbidden fruit of the tree. Notice that we can swap in new vocabulary as the native narrative vocabularies are developing, right? Just like in poetry. You can activate parallel lines of thought and connection by using similar vocabulary. Not identical, right? So it's the same thing here. You can activate the analogy by using a synonym, which in this case is yefat instead of tov, right? We just had God who told him, "I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless you where? Where will Abraham and his house be blessed? In this land is the phrase. In this land. Right? In this land, that's right. So now, after he goes after his own tov, it's like he decides he's going to make it good for himself as opposed to trusting God who said that He will make it good on this land, right? So he got scared almost. We're not told exactly why Abraham leaves the land, right? We're not told exactly why he left the land that was promised, right? You just have to ponder. You just arrived at the land, and God said, I will look out for you and bless you on this land and provide for you in this land. Then the very first narrative after God promises that, he went to Egypt. It's about him leaving the land. So what are we inferring? That maybe grass was greener in Egypt, right? So I think we're being asked to infer something about his motives without the narrator holding our hand through it, right? Right? It's not explicit, but it's inferred through the narrative. He got to Canaan. Going to Canaan was an act of trust, right? Go leave your household. But staying in Canaan was not so much an act of trust. And his poor wife, right? Let's talk about the dynamic. He just hangs her out there to dry. He puts her out there and puts her in harm's way. I mean, for me, this is not a great way to do things, but sometimes I imagine just back in the garden where Eve is by herself with that snake, I wonder why Adam said nothing. We're told that he's with her, right? I feel like it's the same picture of not being protected by the human that is supposed to do that for you, right? It's also that picture of him ruling over her. He's telling her what she needs to do even though it puts her in danger, and she's going to do it. This is Genesis 3:16 in action, right? The sad consequence now is that a man and a woman with different knowings of good and not good brings conflict and power abuse dynamics into the relationship. What else does Genesis 3:16 mean? This is the narrative realization of it. A man rules a woman, right? That's the Genesis 3:16, and he will rule over you, right? In Genesis 3:16, this is the realization within the narrative of Genesis 3:16. A man rules a woman and tries to gain benefit at her expense. So would you say that this is a case of the authors intentionally giving an account of this kind of patriarchal society? I mean, it seems like in the beginning chapters, when they're ruling together, it's supposed to be good. And then after the consequences of the fall, it's explicit that he's going to rule over you. It's after that you get the Nephilim, where they also take the women. And then before that, you get Lamech taking as well, right? Wives for himself. But in these stories, women are the objects to be acted upon and ruled over rather than agents within the story themselves, at least so far. In Genesis 16, we're going to watch the shift, right? It's something that ties in with the author's sort of reading of the situation. I'm trying as hard as I can to check my own interests at the door when I read these biblical texts to see how they play out. It's very hard for me to not see a critique of the male's behavior towards his wife in Genesis 12, right? It's virtually impossible for me not to think that something was going poorly with Abraham's decision. It's too complicated, which is a complicated way of saying that I agree with the author in this instance, right? He's seeking good for himself, Abraham is, on account of his wife, but at her expense so that others can what? What will they do to his wife? What did they do to his wife?
Sarah?
Yeah.
Nothing, just
Well, they see her and they take her. In the narrative, they see her and they take her, right? So let's notice, we have all of our key vocabularies activated. Another helpful way as we move on is sometimes, this is what I do when I see all the vocabulary in a story hyperlinking and activating a specific story. What I sometimes will do is create a silly little stick picture, right? Adam and Eve, right? There's Adam, this is Adam, and then we'll call this Chava or Eve, right? You can see why it's very, and then we have the snake, right? And the snake, what is the role of the snake in the original story? What does the snake do? Okay, deceives. The snake deceives, right, through conversation, right? In this narrative, who is the beautiful thing that should not have been taken, right? Because there's a tree. Yeah, in the first story, it's the fruit that is the beautiful thing that should not have been taken, right? But in this story, what is the beautiful thing? It's the woman this time, right? The woman is the thing that's deceived, right? In the very first story. But in this story, the woman is the thing that's taken. Who is the one that's deceived in this story? Yeah, the deceiver, or the kingly figure that's not Adam, right? So Sarah becomes like the tree, right? Who is the one taking? Who does not that which does not actually belong to them? It's Pharaoh. Pharaoh, right? So Pharaoh becomes the passive thing that takes what doesn't belong to them, allowing that role to play out. But who plays the more active, selfish role here? Abraham, right? So who is the one lying and deceiving? Lying and deceiving in this story? Abraham, right? So he's not passive actually, right? He's actively lying and deceiving, right? In this, he's playing the role of the snake this time. So we can just pause. Do we see what just happened? All of the same characters are present, but the roles are shifting, right? So Jonathan Grossman, an Israeli scholar, has written a lot about this, and we talked about it in times past. We call this dynamic analogy. Dynamic analogy. Analogy, right? So the analogies move around, right? And so he did his dissertation on Esther and the dynamic analogies within the book of Esther, right? So now the male is in the female slot and so on and so forth. And it's God's chosen one who plays the role of the snake, right? This comes back to the question that we have thought about in past sessions. Once God has said and promised what he said in his words to Abraham, I will bless those who bless you. Whoever curses you, treats you as cursed, I will curse. We talked about God's role in the narrative. What is God's role in this narrative right here? Genesis 12. What does he do? As a result of Abraham's choices, what does God do? Just look at the story again. Who's doing what in the story, right? God's present, Abraham's present, Sarah's present, the Pharaoh's present, and they're all doing things. What does God do? He plagues, right? He plagues Pharaoh, right? And so he sends plagues on the Egyptians, right? Which is a thing that we're anticipating in the Exodus story, right? He plagues Pharaoh. He sends plagues on the Egyptian, right? We don't want to get too far ahead, but by the time we get to plagues in the 10 plagues in Egypt, this isn't the first time the Egyptians were plagued by God on account of the Israelites, right? There's the Joseph narrative within the famine, right? There's also a famine that goes on in the Joseph narrative. We're also thinking about Moses in the boat that's being taken out of the water, right? It's laying the groundwork for a bunch of other narratives. But usually when we think of plagues and we think of Egypt, the first story we go to is where? Exodus. But that's not the first time we see it in the narrative, right? The first story where Egypt appears in the Hebrew Bible is this one. Is the one where Abraham lies to Pharaoh and plagues Pharaoh's household as a result. And it's actually the deceptive Israelites who bring death instead of blessing on the nation. I mean, this is weird, but you almost sort of feel bad for the Pharaoh character, right? It's not good to take the lady, but he did not know, right? He's the victim. He's victimized by Abraham's lie. That's why Pharaoh says, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me what was going to happen? Right? This is another example of where something is being left out of the narrative. It's not being specifically or explicitly told to you the moral ramifications of Abraham's actions. But there's plagues now, and then Pharaoh realizes, this is your wife? Why didn't you tell me that she was your wife? And you might wonder how Pharaoh figured that out simply by being plagued, right? There's a conversation we're missing almost. It's a wonderful observation to make because, in other words, the narrative is so fixated on getting people into the slots that it will leave gaps in the narrative that invite your further scrutiny. Because look at what Pharaoh says. What does Pharaoh say to Abraham?
Why is it that you have done?
Yeah, what is this that you have done to me? So he says this phrase. In Hebrew, it's mahasita. Yeah, mahasita. What is this thing you have done? What did God say when he showed up in the garden? Mahasita, Adam. Right? Adam, what is this thing that you have done? Right? So it's, what is this thing that you have done? What did God say to Cain? What is this thing that you have done? Right? So now Pharaoh becomes what figure in this? What slot does Pharaoh hold? The God, right? The God figure that holds Abraham accountable to his action, right? It's a dynamic analogy. Pharaoh is the innocent deceiver, or innocently deceived, right? Yet he's speaking God's words, right? He's the deceived. Pharaoh is the deceived, and he speaks to the deceiver, what is this thing that you have done? Right? He's speaking it to whom this time? Not the snake, but to Abraham. He's not speaking it to Adam, the innocent. He's speaking it to, Eve, the innocent. Who's he speaking it to? The one who did the deception. Right? He speaks God's words here. We've only seen it a handful of times. God, and Pharaoh. Right? This kind of reminds us like when God spoke through a donkey. Right? He's going to speak through whoever he needs to speak through. You can hear his voice within the Egyptian Pharaoh, which later in our story becomes what? A huge empire and the enemy of Israel. But we hear God's words through this particular Pharaoh, right? It's like God's people when they get it into their head that we're the chosen ones, so whatever we do, right? So I want to zero in on this so that we can close out this section. How do you account for God acting violently towards an innocent person in this story? Those who curse you, I will curse. Right? It's awful. I'm uncomfortable with that kind of thought. Right? So we'll talk about the dynamic here. What is it that compelled God to have chosen one human family through whom he can restore blessing? We have to think about the way that the plot embeds with each other. Right? At the beginning, it's like everybody's bad. At the beginning of the story, everybody is bad. After Adam and Eve had failed and the world had become full of violence, right? Everybody's doing a lot of bad things. And if God wants to step in and change it, he chooses Abraham and his family. So to me, even though Pharaoh is the victim, what is Pharaoh still a part of? So Abraham's also a part of. Humanity. The plan to restore humanity, Pharaoh's included, right? Just the driving force and the vehicle of this plan is Abraham, right? That's his portion, right? So to me, Pharaoh is the victim here. He's part of the humanity that's completely violent and lost, right? Was Abraham's family violent and lost? Yes, they're completely a part of the same humanity that Pharaoh's a part of, right? Right? But Abraham was chosen not because of any goodness found in Abraham, but for the grace of God that this would be the vehicle, right? So on that account, you could say that it's part of what's being activated here. When I see a woman and she's beautiful, we take her. That's what the sons of God do in Genesis 6. That's the negative analogy. That's what's resonating here. Here's a man who usually does what men usually do in these types of power situations, right? When you have a king and a king takes a woman for his free use, is that expected? Yeah, because that's what kings can do, right? But here, it's a flip side. Here's a king who has the authority and the power to take whatever woman he would like. They take what they want, but in this scene, does the Pharaoh want to take? No, he thought it was being given, right? However, it does seem to me that the scene right here, verses 12 through 19, is highlighting the deception portion of Abraham's action. Even though Pharaoh is a member of the generally screwed up humanity that's at issue in the narrative of Genesis, right now, in this particular story, is Pharaoh innocent? He is, right? He didn't know. He was sinning out of ignorance, like Leviticus and Deuteronomy will say, you could say. And is sinning out of ignorance a thing in the Torah? Yeah, it's actually, there's laws surrounding the sins out of ignorance, right? The sins of the high hand are the sins that are done intentionally. They're sins of the high hand and they're sins out of ignorance, right? So what's fascinating here is that God, it's as if in giving the freedom and dignity to the human images in the story at the beginning, God is accepting constraints on what He is allowed to do, right? God's baking it into His plan, right? He allows self-constraints to be imposed on what He can and what He will and will not do now. A true partnership requires that kind of understanding, right? Think of any partnership where one party gets carte blanche to do whatever that party wills, right? Is that a good partner? Say you and I enter into a business transaction and you have roles, but at any point in this business, I can choose to override everything that you've done. Is that a true partnership? It's not. It simply is not a true partnership, right? There are rules that God enters into. He allows Himself to be in true partnership with humanity, right? So He constrains His behavior to adjust for these very imperfect beings. It's as if we're seeing what God is having to work with, right? Is the situation of Abraham's family an ideal situation? By no means is it ideal, right? He's part of the same generally screwed up humanity that Pharaoh belongs to. Why does He choose Abraham in the first place? We don't fully know. But this is where God is working. He chose to, if He's going to camp somewhere, He camped here, right? So He commits to protecting and preserving what? Abraham's family. Because at the end of the destiny of Abraham's family is what? Blessing for Abraham? Blessing for humanity. That's the trajectory. It's the choice of this non-ideal situation. So what we end up having is a whole Torah, a whole Ketuvim and Nevi'im, and a whole Greek New Testament that is full of complex moral situations that God has been placed in. He has to work with this non-ideal situation. And so you get to see how God is so wise and how God is working with these non-ideal situations. And it will continue. So what we're seeing here is the birth of the conversation surrounding divine violence. You can already anticipate the conversations around the Amalekites, the conquest of Canaan, Ananias and Sapphira, right? And so these are the complex moral situations. We really cannot dumb it down, right? We do a disservice to the story when we dumb things down like that. It seems to me that this story is a unique and important avenue to considering all of the narratives of divine violence, right? What are all the factors at play? What are all the slots? What's being done here? And this has actually become more real to me as I grow older, because we have to give an accounting to our friends when they're non-believers, or maybe they're not very deeply into Christianity, or they're not very long into their time of following Jesus. These are questions that become very difficult to answer simply, right? They require real wrestling on our part to make sense of what went on here, right? And so now that they've done the thing, right? Now that Adam and Eve has broken Eden, right? Because they chose to break it, we don't have the ideal to work with anymore. So all of the options outside of Eden are non-ideal. So we choose the ones that seems to be the best avenue functionally for the way forward. So this is what it means to be a moral agent in the world, right? You have to choose wisdom. You have to act wisely, right? And so what's fascinating in the Hebrew Bible is that by God accepting this limit, by entering into a covenant partnership with actual people who are non-ideal, the narrative in no way vindicates or endorses Abraham's behavior, right? The Bible right here in this narrative is not endorsing what Abraham did. It's actually a tragic thing that Abraham should not have done. Right? The fact that God defends Abraham does not endorse Abraham's behavior. Right? The narrative analogy is condemning his behavior, but yet God made a promise. So you could almost say that now that you have what feel like divine what feels like divine values and Abraham's values are now in tension with one another, but their stories are bound, right? So there's a God's commitment to His promise, and then there's God's commitment to doing justice, and the complex moral situation that arises is the tension between the two. So what else is the story of the Hebrew Bible except God acting in complex ways to be faithful to His promise to restore blessing to humanity? It's difficult for us to reconcile these very complex ideas of justice, right? But what if the narrative is actually trying to tell us that the situations are complicated, right? That's the situation that God has allowed Himself to be in if He's going to truly partner with a creature other than Himself. Even if it's a divine image, it's an other that He's allowing dignity and freedom. And within this freedom, He's entering into true partnership, which is why I love this story, is that every character is put in... I love the story of the Bible because every time you step forward in the narrative, you get a character being put in a very complex situation. It's a complicated ethical situation, right? And not everybody leaves with their hands clean. Right? Once again, I don't think this is just of historical interest, but I think this is heavy-duty theology to think about in the story of, by means of the design patterns, right? Other thoughts or reflections on this? Is this the last time that Abraham is going to pull this stunt? No, it's not the last. Yeah, it will repeat, right? It plays out a little differently in the story of Abimelech, right? And what does Abimelech mean? So so you know the word Av or Abba, right? Father. So Abim is a descriptor for Melech, which is king. So Abimelech is my father is a king. That's what the name means. Abimelech is my father is a king, right? And in that story, in Abimelech's story, God appears to Abimelech in a dream and says, hey, don't touch that lady. He intervenes this time, right? It's Yahweh that plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues on account of Sarah. So I'm wondering if actually, because remember we had to wonder, how did Pharaoh get the idea that's actually his wife through the plagues? In the Abimelech story, we have an analogy where God actually intervenes with Pharaoh and says, don't touch the lady, right? That's his wife, right? I don't want to curse you, so don't touch her, right? And so I'm wondering if in this story we can assume that behind the scenes and not privy to the narrator, God's actually working in lives other than just Abraham's. Right? And I'm wondering if there's a kind of thing that he impresses upon Pharaoh that makes him realize, why did you do that to me? Why didn't you just tell me? Right? And so this was the reason he did it in the Abimelech story. So it's as if the narrator tells us and then somehow Pharaoh just knows that he should not touch this woman. Abraham's going to pull the stunt twice, and then that happens in the second time. Right? The next generation will replay the sins of the ancestors. The next generation replays the sins of the parents, right? That's what happens in the story, right? So it's just that itself, Genesis 3 and 4 is a thing that goes on. Is there an intentional ambiguity when it says Yahweh plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues on account of Sarah? You might expect that sentence to read, and God plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues on account of Pharaoh, right? You might expect it to say that. It's because of Pharaoh's action that he was plagued. But the sentence says, Yahweh plagued Pharaoh's house with great plagues on account of Sarah. Right? The wording sounds there like it could be some assigning to blame to Sarah. But if you remember the repetition of on account of you, right? So that there will be blessing to me on account of you. Right? And so there's a whole other thing, a layer that's happening here. It's a repetition that we're not coloring in. But Abraham says in verse 13, there will be tov, or tov for me, ba'avura. So there will be tov for me, ba'avura, or on account of you. Right? In verse 16, he did tov to Abraham, ba'avura, on account of her. Right? Everything is on account of Sarah in this story. Right? It's just following a pattern. So by the time it gets to great plagues on Pharaoh's house on account of Sarah, it's because of the simple decision that Abraham commanded his wife to lie. Right? And so what we have here is Abraham at like full force of his fallenness. Right? We're seeing how sordid and how seedy he can get. Right? And she's, I don't know what else to do but be discomforted by Abraham's choice. Right? We could camp out here more, but just look at how the creative reuse of language, right? We didn't even look at the on account of repetition until now. Right? That's a repetition that we didn't highlight because we're just following Tov, right? But that's the dynamic of analogy, right? So now we'll do another one. We'll go to 28. Any questions before we move on? Can somebody read the quote of 28?
This is programmatic for the whole storyline of the Hebrew Bible. There are going to be snake people, and there are going to be humanity people. And these two are going to be at enmity with each other in narrative after narrative.
Yep. All right. 28. Can you read the question?
In the birth story of Jacob and Esau in Genesis 25, how is Jacob like the snake of Genesis 3? What tension does this create for the overall storyline?
Okay, let's take note. What's some of the loot that Abraham brought out of Egypt, out of this whole debacle?
Oxen. He was prosperous, so let's see.
What plunder? Yeah.
Sheep.
Yeah, sheep.
There was for him sheep and oxen and donkeys and male and female servants and female donkeys and camels.
And?
That's it. And the woman, of course, and everything.
Male and female slaves.
Yeah, and male and female slaves. Yeah.
Right? So he not only got livestock, but he also got chattel. Right? Male and female slaves. So Egyptian slaves. So who's the first in our story to get slaves? Abraham. And what kind of slaves?
Both male and female.
Egyptian.
Whatever they are.
Yeah.
Because
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Whatever slaves that came from Egypt, right? And so I wonder if any of those Egyptian female slaves play a prominent role in Abraham's story. Hagar, right? And so here we already have, before we even get to the Egyptian slavery, we have Abraham sinning against other image bearers through ownership, right? Abraham receives Egyptian slaves and he misuses them later, right? So this is very subtle. If I didn't highlight this, we would have just talked about the livestock, right? But this is so subtle on the narrator's part. Genesis 16. Do you remember what was in the list of blessings that God said to Abraham?
yeah, it will be a blessing to people.
I'm going to bless you and then the next line is, I'm going to make you a great nation. What is required to become a great nation? People. So he's going to have kids. Right? Genesis 16. Now Sarah, Abraham's wife, had borne no children yet. But she did have this Egyptian slave that was gained through what? How did deception, right? He gained this woman through deception. Do you know what her name was? Okay. Hagar. Do you know what Hagar means? Huh? Yeah. So ha is the Hebrew. It's an article meaning the. Okay. So like ha Elohim is the God, right? That's how you know it's God. It's a noun, right? So so ha ha'etz, the tree, something like that. So whenever you see ha, like Hashem, Shem is name, right? And so in modern Jewish communities, they don't say the divine name of Yahweh, right? It's disrespectful to say that. So they say Hashem, or the name, right? This is, the name is the one who's blessing us. So they pray to the name because they don't want to say the actual name. So ha is the word for the, okay? Gar is the word for immigrant. The immigrant, right? So there's an Egyptian slave whose name is the immigrant, right? Are there going to be immigrants in our story later? Yeah, right? It will play a prominent role in the indictments against Israel in the prophets. You misuse the immigrant, right? That's what they say. So this is going to be a story about the Israelites oppressing the immigrant, right? This is a story about Israel oppressing Hagar, right? And so Sarah said, Abraham, look, the Lord has prevented me from having children. Did the Lord prevent them from having children? This is what Sarah believes, right? Right? We have to remember that when we're reading the story, we're reading a narrative drama. So Sarah says to Abraham, look, the Lord has prevented me from having children. And what does he say? Go into my slave. So was Hagar a consensual relationship? No. This is now the woman telling the man to do something. Flip of what just happened. The man telling the woman to do something. And then what does she say? Perhaps I will obtain children through her. So it involves the stealing of children born of sexual assault. Right? And the word obtain here is the word bana. Obtain. Right? It's kind of odd here because you don't need to use this word to say what he's saying. But here, it's the word to build. Right? So now we have the Tower of Babel in the background. Right? And I'm going to make a name. There's something about it that is not just about getting or birthing, but to build. It's an odd phrase, right? It's a construction term. It's used primarily of buildings, right? So it's to build. The first time it appears here, where's the first time the word bana shows up?
I think Genesis 2. He built.
Yeah. So So the word in the Adam and Eve story is he takes a rib, which is the side. We use the word rib, but the word that's used there is actually side, like the side of a house, a wall, right? And so Adam's side is taken, and banad, out of the side, is the woman. He builds a woman out of the side of Adam. He builds a woman. So here in this story, there's a woman who wants to build herself through what? Through children. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarah. All right, there's a repetition. He listened to the voice of Sarah. Now I'm sure, right, we already get it. We don't need the chart anymore. We're starting to pick up the repetition. So this is the benefit of reading slowly and intentionally and questioning every sentence. because this brings us up to speed. We already get, okay, I know where the drama's going. It's going to revolve around what Abraham will do here. And so this is Genesis again. It's the snake. You can already hear the voice of the snake in the garden telling them to do something they ought not to do because they think they understand the purpose, right? We get it. It's the same story replaying. Sarah here is like the snake. Taking another woman is the tree this time. Abraham is what? He's listening to the voice of his wife. He's in Eve's place, right? He's in Eve's place this time. He's being deceived. Do you remember what God said to Adam? What did God say to Adam in Genesis 3? Because you listened to the voice of your wife, right? Then to Adam, God said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, Genesis 3:17. So now we've got a man, we've got a woman, and this time we have another woman, right? Not two men and a woman. This time it's two women. Right?
Isn't it the curse is that the woman will desire?
Will desire
The husband.
the husband.
Here,
Exactly.
Abraham
Is
listening.
Yeah, exactly. And so he's not ruling, right? And so now we've got a man, and we've got a woman, and we've got another, but he is ruling over Hagar, right? He exercises power over Hagar. He could have said no, and he should have said no, right? Because it's a slave. It's another human being, right? The whole thing is to bless humanity. But what is this thing you're doing, Abraham, right? So this is the drama's set, right? Our instincts are in the right direction already. Our dynamic analogies are being activated. Characters can swap, but we can still track, right? And so we've got a man listening to his wife, right? Our instinct is that Sarah is not being deceived, right? She's in the Eve slot in our minds. But she's going to be like the snake and Eve at the same time, because it doesn't quite work out for her in the end either, right? So let's keep going. Abraham listened to the voice of Sarai. What does he get out of this? What does Abraham have to do?
Well, he has to impregnate Hagar, right? Or listen, or
Yeah.
act upon that. Okay,
Yeah.
that is what you want.
Yeah,
I will build you up.
Yeah, exactly. So after Abram lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, so 10 years they've been in the land of Canaan and no kids yet. Abraham's wife took Hagar, or Abraham's wife took the immigrant, the Egyptian one, her slave, and gave her to her husband. She took and she gave to her husband. That's what Eve did, right? She took the fruit and she gave it to Adam, right? Do you see it? So it's the exact same language of Genesis 3, repeated, verbatim, like no ifs, ands, or buts about it. They're so deliberate with it. It's the exact same language of Genesis 3. And he went into the immigrant, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had become pregnant, now the immigrant is pregnant. Then her mistress Sarai became cursed in her sight. There's the phrase. This is now God has to act, right? They've made the non-ideal situation even less ideal. Then her mistress Sarai became cursed in her sight.
Question. So, good.
Good.
But at this time, the pregnancy should be good.
But it's
But
cursed.
bad.
It's cursed this time. Exactly. So it's the same word that God said in Genesis 12. Hagar is the victim. The immigrant is the victim. But once again, she gains something. Hagar gains a position of privilege because she blesses Abraham with a kid. Right? She blesses Abraham with a kid. But Sarai becomes cursed but Hagar becomes cursed in Sarai's sight. Right? So the narrative becomes a little complicated. You could already feel it being complicated. Right? She becomes privileged as the one who can bear children for Abraham. And what does she do with the privileged status? Well, she made the best out of a bad hand. She becomes privileged in Abraham's sight. This becomes a power game for her now, too. The victim becomes the victimizer. So everybody's screwed up in this story. All of the three characters really don't make it out innocent. I just think that maybe it's important to point that out, that the complications of the family dynamic was not lost on the narrator, right? That Hagar's not simply some object here. What's being emphasized, though, is in the patterning that we're talking about, is is the cultural implications of what had just happened to the immigrant, right? It's very hard to read a passage like this and not be constantly thinking you cannot give another human being to a human being like that to be used like that, right? But the author is not emphasizing consent necessarily as the main violation, right? That's not at least the author's goal, the main sin, right? I just wanted to maybe say it out loud so that we can continue to talk about this, right? There's a cultural gap here. The question is, what's the narrator's evaluation of the entire situation?
Can I make
Yeah.
on 16:6? It's like Pilate.
Yeah.
Behold the man, do whatever you please, and he washes his hands.
Wash his hands of
Just
it.
like Abraham, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's out of my control. You told me to do something, I did it. Right? I cannot be held responsible. But we know from our perspective as readers that all of this is clearly negative. Through the analogies, he's presenting his behavior towards Hagar as taking the thing that doesn't rightly belong to you. She's an Egyptian. She's her own person. She is not your wife. You cannot take her like that, right? So it is a negative evaluation of what Abraham did. It's maybe giving the negative evaluation, but on a different axis than we typically think about it. So, right? But even in the language of taking a woman, taking a wife, it's inherently offensive, right, in our ears to take a wife. But that's not the undertones going on the passage necessarily. So what other narratives so far have portrayed figures seeing a woman and taking her negatively? The Nephilim? Right? Samson? Right? Exactly. There's so many stories that are activating this same awful thing. And it's a result of the curse. The man will rule. Right? Right? It's Sheba and David. Yeah, Bathsheba and David. He took her. He saw her as beautiful and he took her. And he conceived a child from her. And he killed passively her husband. Right? And so we have Lamech in the mix, who took many wives, and Pharaoh. Right? They're all negative portraits. In Genesis 2:24, we have the thing, a man will leave his father, mother, and be joined. Not take, be joined. They become one. He doesn't take, he becomes one. There's no taking, it's two becoming one, right? And so this is still very much the construction, right? So in our modern ears, we have to sort of retool the cultural gap, but it's overarchingly negative. Right? So I'm perpetually surprised by the lack of criticism of what Abraham does in this particular story. It's not good, right? What he does is not good. It's male abuse of power, right? It's actually quite stunning that it's not prominently featured in the way that we teach passages like this, right? It's interesting that they don't, because if you were looking along the dynamic analogy, it's quite obvious Abraham did something he should not have done. Right? Especially when you look further on to Hagar here is a narrative analogy for immigrant in Israel. Right? So in the Hebrew Bible, there's no word for rape. They don't use it, but they use the word seize and take. Right? They're always seized. The power is implied in the verb. Right? And then they took them. Right? So it's not just that they approve of it, they're already saying that this was no good from the get-go. Right? They conceptualize it and think of it differently. For us in our culture, we want words that inherently contain the negativity. Right? Seizing and taking feel soft in our language. Right? We want to use the word sexual assault or rape. But in this passage, that's essentially what's being described using the Hebrew language, take. Right? Especially in the fact that in this literature, in this ancient culture, they're using a lot of nuance. So it doesn't address it in the way that we would prefer, but I think it's not approving of it by any means. In fact, in the next couple of verses, which keep on the analogies, will eliminate any possibility that it was a good idea. So now Hagar is pregnant, and she's using her chance to gain status. Right? But she's a slave. She needs to get some form of power. She uses it to treat Sarah as what? Despised. So then Sarah comes to Abraham and says, What does Sarah say to Abram? May the what? Okay, so the wrong there, so the phrase there is not just wrong, it's the same thing that God sees the word full of. May the violence, may the Hamas done to me be done upon you. I gave my slave into your bosom, and when she saw that she conceived, I was despised in her eyes. I was treated as cursed in her eyes. May the Lord judge between you and me. And Abraham said to Sarah, look, your slave is in your hands. He washes his hands. He doesn't want, this is too complicated for me at this point. Do to her what is tov in your eyes, right? He doesn't want to make the decision. You do whatever you want then. Right? He's passive. He doesn't want to make any choice here.
I think he was really deceived. I thought everything is okay.
Yeah.
You're the one who's
Yeah, sure.
interested in the Argentine, right?
Exactly.
Now you're...
Yeah. He was deceived, and also he should have known better, right? Just like Adam was also deceived, but he really should have known better, right? And so Sarah oppressed her, and she, that is Hagar, fled from her presence. Now we have a fleeing, like Cain, right? We have a fleeing like Cain. This is a damning portrait of Abraham and Sarah. Their dysfunction has ruined effectively the life of another human being and her child, right? There's no holds barred here. They let their family dispute ruin another person's life. It's really intense. You can imagine the emotional intensity required of a situation like this. It's Cain. He's distressed. He's running to the wilderness. It's actually every single one of the patterns that we've seen so far condensed into a family story about a sexual assault, an ill-conceived child, and then a breaking of a household. It's Adam and Eve. It's Cain. It's the sons of God. It's the whole thing. And so we can spend a lot more time here, but just look at what we can do with this language now. So the response is like a postcard. Once you see it, you really don't need to see the charts anymore. You can just think about what happened mentally. I'll take you home. Okay, sure. So we've been doing this for a couple of hours now. We're going to close now, but it's so intuitive because it's just repetition, right? We get it. It's so intuitive. The translation makes a big deal, though, because a lot of times the repetition that we don't see is because the translation is doing a lot of the obscuring for us, right? So this is why I think that as people who want to responsibly read the Bible, we need to read multiple translations, right? Which is why it's good to have a phone that can give you access to multiple translations, right? And arm yourself with a concordance, see the repetitions. It just highlights that point when you read and we're just trying to follow along with you, but once the repetitions are there, right? Sarai treated her harshly, right? Sarai treated her harshly. That's a more polite word than oppression, but the word there in Hebrew is oppression. He didn't just treat her harshly. Sarai oppressed her. This is the same language that will be used of the Egyptians oppressing the Israelites in their captivity. It's repetition purposefully, right? And so when we're talking about the sins of the fathers are being visited on the generations past, this is what we're talking about. And so then what does he say? Behold, your maid is in your power. Your slave is in your hand. This is what Pilate says to Jesus about Jesus. The narrative analogies are so thick, right? And so if you read Robert Alter, he's got some really good things to offer, and we could do this all day, but I just want to round us off the corner with two examples, right? That will take a little bit of reflection and give us a little bit of time. So you have in front of you another chart that I made for you if you have your papers. This is the birth story of a man who will be called Israel, the birth narrative of Israel. It's in Genesis 25, and it starts in verse 20. So, verse 20, Genesis 25. And Yitzhak, this Abraham's son, was a son of 40 years. So this is a very awkward Hebrew phrase. And Yitzhak, Abraham's son, was a son of 40 years. The Hebrew phrase, when you say somebody is a number of years old, you say a son of so many years. That's a Hebrew phrase. Instead of saying, oh, he's 40 years old, oh, he's a son of 40 years. That's how they say it in Hebrew. So Isaac was a son of 40 years when he took Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel, Aramean, of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean, to be his wife. And Yitzhak petitioned Yahweh on behalf of his wife, because she was barren. And Yahweh was petitioned by him, and Rebekah his wife was conceived. And they struck one another, that is, the sons within her. And then she said, if it is so, then why am I? And then she went to inquire of Yahweh, and Yahweh said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples will be separated from your body. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. And then when her days were fulfilled to give birth, behold, twins within her womb. The first came out Edom. Do you know that word, Edom? The first came out Edom. What does it say in your text? Red. The first came out red. That's the phrase. Edom means red. So the first came out Edom all over, like a hairy garment. So they named him Esau. Right? But, so it says red, right? Your text says red, right? He came out red, right? So this is so important. The Hebrew word for red is Edom. Does Edom become a very important part of Israelite history? Yes, they fight a lot. So the first one came out red, hairy all over, like a hairy garment. They named him Esau. And afterward, his brother came out, and his hand was snatching at the heel of Esau. And they named him, and because he was snatching at the akeb of his brother, akeb is the heel, they named him Yaakov, which Jacob, right? The one who grasps at the akeb, the one who grasps at the heel. And Isaac was a son of 60 years when she gave birth to them. So if you read that story, if you listen to me read the story, it's kind of difficult to follow. It's full of gaps. And, right, you sort of get the general gist of things, right? But this is typical. It's enigmatic and it's full of gaps. But this is the birth story of Israel, the birth of Israel. What is the overarching story of Israel's birth? It's a story of a sibling rivalry, right? It's the story of 2 brothers who fight. When was the last time we had 2 brothers who fought? This is Esau's story, Jacob and Esau. Before this, Cain and Abel. We have a template for how this shakes out, right? They don't agree on something, and one of them is dead at the end, right? And so we're totally working out of the Cain and Abel template, right? Rival brothers. So what I want to just highlight here before we close, there's many things we can do. I just want to focus on this little panel in verses 24 to 26. So if you could get eyes on verse 24 and 26. And then you have a chart. Okay? If you can just get eyes on this little thing right here. 24 and 26. What is the action in verses 24 and 26? What's happening? Yeah, it's a birth moment, right? It's the birth moment. And then you get these 2 little triads, right? One comes out first, and a statement of what he looks like or what he was doing. Then the naming. Do you see that? It's a triad. He's coming out, what he looks like or what he's doing, and then the name. It comes in 3 steps. For Esau, he comes out what? Adom, red. Right? This is red like dirt, like clay. So he comes out red. And so this is one of the names of the descendants of Esau, right? Edom is red. The Edomites, right? The father of Edom comes out of Adom, a man who is Adom, red. The other main name for in the Hebrew Bible for the Edomites is the what? Maybe you guys don't know this one, but there's another name for the Edomites. The people of Seir. So there's the Edomites and the people of Seir. It's the same people. And he comes out Seir. He comes out hairy. It's the exact same letters. So literally, every name that the descendants of this guy are being given, through his birth story. Do you see that? Edom and Seir are coming out of Adom, Esau. Right? It's very typical. Then his brother comes out. Do you know why he's named Yaakov? Yeah. His hand is grasping at the heel, like, me first. Right? He's trying to pull him back in so he could be the first. Right? So there's a birthright kind of thing. I'm going to be the firstborn. Does that play out in Yaakov's story? Through deception, no less. With a woman, right? And food. Right? So the patterns are so there. Right? He's grasping at the heel. So the birth descendant is born, so the birth of Yaakov is there. And he's born doing what? The second step, he's grasping at the heel. So we haven't focused on this, but we brought it up many, many sessions ago. If you do a word search in a concordance through the Hebrew Bible about the word heel, you'll find some pretty interesting things. Heel, and then you use the word for somebody grabbing. How many hits are you going to get? If you searched heel and grabbing. Maybe you don't, just guess. How many times are there heels and grabbing in the story? Of the whole Bible. Actually, not a lot. It's few. It's 2. There's only 2 stories of heels and grabbing. This one is the second. The snake, it's Genesis 3:15. The only other time we get heel and grabbing is Genesis 3:15, where we get the enigmatic prophecy, where the consequence for the snake that is cursed, that will eat the dust of the feet for the remainder of his days. And God says there will be enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. And then that is that the seed of the woman will stomp on your head and you will grasp him at the heel. It is the only other time it happens. Right? Look closely here. Your seed, who is the your there? Whose seed is being talked about? The seed of the snake and the seed of the woman, right? I will put enmity between 2 offspring, right? Now we have the offspring rivalry. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between the seeds. So who are the 2 here? Whose seed are we talking about? Here we're talking about Adam and the serpent. Right? The serpent will have seed that will bite at the heel, but then Adam will have a seed that will stomp on the head, right, of the serpent. Right? And her seed, it's the woman, will bruise the head of the snake. And the snake, his head will be crushed, and he will bruise you on the head. Right? It's really tricky. Who will he bruise? The woman or the heel, or... The Hebrew is actually quite ambiguous. So if you read it, it says, I will put enmity between you and the woman. Where's the enmity between? The woman and the serpent, right? Because God is talking to the snake. And between your seed and her seed. So both enmity between the woman and the serpent and the seed of the 2. He shall bruise you on the head. Who is the he? Yeah, whoever the he is, right? This is Genesis 3. They don't know Jesus yet, right? So the offspring, the seed of the woman will bruise you on the head, the serpent. Will he bruise the offspring of the snake or the snake? It's actually kind of vague in the poetry, right? And so he shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. It's tricky. It's good Hebrew poetry. It applies a lot of ways. And so you've got your seed, the snake's seed, and then you have the seed of the woman. And the seed of the woman is going to step on the head, and you're going to step on the woman. You're going to grab the heel. In other words, what we're being told is the entire storyline of the Hebrew Bible will be a retelling of these two moments of the crushing of the head and the grasping at the heel, right? And there's going to be snake people, and there's going to be humanity people, people of the woman and people of the snake. And these two are going to be at enmity with each other in the narrative, all across Scripture, right? Narrative after narrative. Think of Cain and Abel. Who is the one who followed the snake or the serpent crouching at the door? In Cain. In the Cain story, Cain is the one who listened to the creature crouching at the door that's desiring, right? And so in Genesis 4, we're watching the seed of the woman become the seed of the snake, right? Because we know that Cain comes from whom? The woman. But there was a point in Cain's life where he became the seed of the snake by choosing to replay the sins of his parents, right? And that's the dynamic analogy. The seed of the woman, Cain, literally the seed of this woman, makes a choice to not rule over the beast crouching at his door. And he does what is tov in his own eyes, and he begins acting deceptive like the snake. Come to my field. He kills his brother, right? That sets the program. So every human I'm going to meet in this narrative, we're going to wonder, will they go the way of the snake or will they go the way of the woman? It's this moral narrative that we see ourselves acting within and without, and so people can switch back and forth. You can become the seed of the woman and act beautifully, and you can become the seed of the snake. In the story of Abraham and Pharaoh, who's the seed of the snake? Abraham. He deceives. He lies. Abraham becomes the seed of the snake until his own redemption moment, which is this. When does Abraham receive a redemption moment? When does he choose to become the seed of the woman? In his story. You have to think of the entire Abraham story. When is the first time faith actually becomes a part of Abraham's actual story? With his son Yitzhak, right? At Isaac, at the mountain. Right? That's where he chooses. Right? So even the people that God calls to be his servant of blessing can still choose the way of the snake. We're watching the birth story of a man named Israel right now, Yitzhak or Yaakov. Right? How is he depicted as he comes out of the seed of the woman? Biting at a heel. Right? The seed of a woman comes out biting at a heel. That's how he's given to us. It's the same word for bite. That's why they call him heel biter or ankle biter. You're just an ankle biter. That's a phrase that we still use. It comes from here. And so how is he depicted as he comes out of the seed of the woman? As an ankle biter. He's doing physically what the snake is going to do to the seed of the woman. In this case, who is the seed of the woman? Esau. And if we know Esau's story, he's completely innocent. He's almost stupid, right? He's just dumb. He hunts. He comes home. He's so hungry, he sells his birthright. He's completely taken advantage of by this ankle biter. And at the end, remember when they depart for a very long time? And Jacob is so scared that Esau is going to kill him, he splits his camp. Right? Do you remember the story where he splits his camp? He says, okay, half of my stuff will be here. I'll be here because I don't know what my brother will do. Right? And then every time his brother comes and brings a gift, what does he do? He sends it back. Oh, I don't know, right? And then what happens when he sees Esau in a distance? If we're expecting Esau to be a people of the serpent, what would Esau do? You betrayed me. You took my birthright. Kills him. But what does he do? He kisses his feet. It's not an ankle bite. It's a feet kiss. Right? It's complete reversal. Yaakov is the one who is the ankle biter, right? So every narrative about this man, Yaakov, is going to involve how he bites at the heels of people, right? Deception, lying, cheating, so that he can achieve his own blessing and goodness in his own eyes. And so God is going to allow people to be, is God going to allow people to be cheated and deceived out of 20 years of his life? That's the Jacob story, right? Jacob's story is how he lies and cheats his way through life. But does it work out for him? He gets cheated too, right? He gets cheated out of years of his life, right? And he also gets cheated so badly that what happens? His sons lie to him. About whom? Joseph. He's dead. Right? So the drama plays so beautifully and so tragically. And so as we continue to follow the story of Jacob, we'll begin to see just how deep these narrative repetitions can go. And you can see once you start to really read, it really unlocks so much of the New Testament because they're thinking the same way. Right? They're thinking about the redemption of time. There's this little phrase in Ephesians where it says, we are redeeming the time, for the days are evil. And so in our word, in our language, redeeming the time, what does that sound like? So some of your translations will not say redeeming the time, it'll say make best use of your time. Right? We're trying to save time, we're trying to use it wisely. But the Greek word there is this phrase, ex agora. Ex means to remove, and agora means market. Ex agora together is to remove from market. It's a slave term, right? So what it means is that we're removing something from the market of slavery. It's to buy out of slavery. It's to liberate, to free. And so when Paul is talking about the redemption of the time, he's talking about the days being freed from evil. It's a grand vision of the world. And so this is totally tied into what story? Exodus, where they were bought out of the market. No longer slaves, but the people of God. Right? And so here we are at a crux of the story. We're now looking at how repetition happens over stories and stories and stories, and then the meanings compound and become more complex. And so what I'm talking about with you guys today is like an exciting beginning to a long-standing tradition of thinking deeply about our story. And so I'll close with this here. The next time we meet, we'll be closing the story of Jacob. But there's a lot that can be done. We only have so much time. We're trying to close out the season. But I think this is a really great story for us here to talk about how God works with the non-ideal people that He's entered into covenant relationship with. The birth of Israel in the book of Genesis is the story of a snake, right? Of a heel biter. And so we go from Yaakov, which means what? The heel biter, right? And what does his name become? Israel. What does Israel mean? The man who wrestled with God, right? And how does that story end for Israel? He leaves with a broken hip, right? So you get the heel biter, and then he's crushed. So what does it mean to break a hip? Can you walk? You will limp for the rest of your life. Especially they don't have artificial hips, right? So a man is humbled by God in that story. The heel biter becomes humbled by God through the breaking of a hip, right? And that's his Mount Moriah story. That's when the faithfulness in God becomes real to Israel, right? And so here we are. This is where we'll land for this week, and we'll go into next week. But any questions or thoughts before we close? It's a lot to think about, of course, but I think I can already tell as we read that you guys are able to read through the dynamic analogies. You guys are able to notice repetitions. You guys are able to see just how intentional each phrasing is and how subtle nuance is if we just slow down, like, oh, it's not on account of Pharaoh, it's on account of Sarah, right? Those are the tiny little details that inform us of the moral weight of each story. Abraham really screwed up with Pharaoh, right? He subjected an innocent Pharaoh to a curse, right? Puts God in a hard position, right? And God intervenes through plague, but also apparently through allowing Pharaoh to come to his senses. Why did you do this to me? And Pharaoh speaks God's words, Mahasita, why did you do this? What have you done? Right? And holds Abraham to account. Right? And so really complex stories ahead of us, but I think we've done good work for tonight. Any last words before I close?
It's interesting that what Abraham did,
Still he was blessed, exactly. Yeah, he made it out with money and slaves. And he had another choice, right? So in that Pharaoh moment, he chose to act like a snake, right? He heel bit. But then when he left and went back to Canaan, he absolutely had a choice. You're back in the land, and in this land, God promised He would bless you. But you're still saying, it's been 10 years, I don't have a kid. I have to misuse this Egyptian slave. And it spells trouble for his family, right? Most of the times when we think of Egypt in slavery, we're thinking of Exodus and how the people were oppressed under Egypt. But the very first time we hear about oppression and slaves in Egypt is actually an Egyptian slave being oppressed by Abraham, right? And Sarai. And yeah, and yeah. Sure. Yeah, exactly. And so we see an arc. Even Moses at the beginning of his narrative, Moses is the silhouette prophet, right? He's the one that no one came like Moses. But even Moses murdered a man. He hid in the desert for a very long time. He tried to weasel his way out of God. I'm the God of your fathers. I'm sending you. I don't think it's me, God. I can't speak. It can't be me. And he's, no, you're going, right? And then by the end of his life, he still doesn't get to go to the promised land, right? And so we have these characters that are so complex. There's great moments of faith, but there's still great moments of fallenness, right? And even the best characters are that, imperfect, in very, very complicated ways. And I think that's very true of our lives. When we think about it, it's so easy to simplify another person and think that they don't have reasons for doing what they did that are hurtful, right? But everybody's complicated. And so I think the real goal here is recognizing that every single one of us are image bearers who are imperfect. And at our best moments are, seed of the woman. But at our worst moments, we're heel biters, right? And finding grace for those people is exactly how Jesus went forward with his life, right? Don't you realize that I came for the sick? This is exactly Jesus' modus operandi. And I think the more that we continue to barrel down these particular stories, the New Testament gets new life, I think. We get new stories about the way Jesus thought about things because he's living the scriptures, right? And so this is where we'll end. I'll close us in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and for this opportunity to once again study Scripture in a thoughtful and methodical way, Lord. And I hope that with each passing session we get more and more exercise with reading Scripture well and properly, and to really glean and to pick at each passage and see really what you're communicating with us. And hopefully to get a clearer and more robust view of your heart for the world. Lord, we love you and give you all the glory and praise. In your name we pray. Amen.